Hello humans, Master Dinnerflex here, bringing you the low quality content you deserve. And today I decided I'm going to do for Live Twins what I did with Lair of Darkness. Because I could just give you a deck profile, but this deck is a little more up in the air than I thought it would be. Because a lot of people who are making lists like, this is what it's going to look like once we get Burst of Destiny, I actually think a lot of those lists are very, very unrefined. And actually playtesting them, you notice how many issues are actually in the deck. So much so that I don't think this deck is actually solved at all. I just think we have a baseline of what the deck is. But in all actuality, anyone telling you this is what it's going to look like are not being entirely truthful. Not that they're lying, it's just like, it's not really that solved. And the reason that is just due to the fact that Twins are a very simple, small engine that, it's all filled with one-card starters, but its win condition alone isn't good enough. So a lot of the times it needs, anti-meta, such as hand traps, trap cards, or just all-around good disruption cards. And then this one-card engine of the Live Twins are going to help keep you in the game and maintain your card advantage until you've just won. So, with that being in mind, you cannot treat the Live Twin engine as a very, very solid win condition, because the truth is, this is just a few steps up from what Trickstar was back in the day, where this deck can actually out Mechanical Chaser and deal with back row and actually cause problems for the opponent, whereas Trickstar could not. It's still in the range of, if you're only taking into account what Live Twin cards do alone, this is not a real win condition in comparison to all the other decks. You need some backbone to it. So I decided I'm just going to give you some templates like what I did for Lair of Darkness. But before I go over these templates, as you can see, I'm in a solo room, because in order for you to understand these templates, you need to understand what one starter does. So let's just go with Kissy Kill. You're going to get Lilla. And then you are going to link these two into the Link Kissy Kill. And then you're going to activate the Link Kissy Kill to revive the Lilla. And the moment you start reviving with the links, you are now locked into Fiend monsters in the extra deck. So we will link the Lilla and the Kissy Kill link into Lilla Link. We will activate the Lilla link to revive the Kissy link. That gives us a draw 1. That's funny. And then we are going to link these two link 2s into a link 4 of Trouble Sunny. So by simply one starter, you now have a 3300 beater, a draw, and this 3300 beater can tag out into 2 link 2s, and that one of those link 2s will pop an opponent's card as, since you can revive it on your opponent's turn, it's a disruption, and then Kissy will get you another draw. So that's what this... Wow, I'm not actually planning to just draw this insane. But, that's the point of this engine, is it's a very, very small, minor engine that gives you a lot of cards, and kind of sets up a wall for your opponent. And in the process of doing that, you're gaining cards, and you're gaining link materials. That's what's actually so good about this deck. It's not the fact that you can tag in and out of Sunny over and over again. It's the fact that the monsters you're reviving are link 2s. So going into your opponent's turn, you can just do something like this. Nightmare Unicorn, spin a card, draw a card. Kissy will revive something. Lilla pop a card. Sunny send the level 8. Send another card. So you can just link climb, because here's another link 4. Let's go Abomination. Lilla will revive Kissy, so we will draw another card. And then we can turn these two into Sunny. And then 3033, and these will tag it back into the link 2s, so for game. But that's what I kind of want to get across, is that this is what this deck does alone, and this is a very, very solid engine. That one of the issues with the Evil Twin engine beforehand, like with the very early versions with Eldritch, is that the deck itself still needed a backbone, and the truth is, it still kind of needs it. Because while this is some fantastic one-card interactions, and you're gaining a lot of card advantage and link materials, the disruptions you are giving your opponent is quite literally one pop, and then if those 2 draws you get are hand traps, those are accounted for, but you can't account for random. So now that we got that out of the way, we can discuss deck building with live twins themselves. Alright, so what you should be seeing on screen now is a lot of nonsense, but it's going to make more sense later. As a matter of fact, I got some random ratios that I want to move around a bit. But the idea here is, this is pretty much a pure list I have on screen. But this is how, like, warpable this deck is. Because when you're thinking about it, I compared it to Trick Stars earlier back in the day, except Live Twins actually have a foundation, whereas Trick Stars didn't. But this deck, not only has that foundation, but it has the same form of, like, adaptability and mutation. But because of this adaptability and mutation, this deck always functions as an anti-meta deck rather than a deck that is meant to be the best deck. This deck can never really be the best deck because its entire design philosophy is about beating what's going on, like Trickstar, but on its own, it doesn't really accomplish an insane amount. It just does have a lot of fair interactions, but very quickly it accumulates so much card advantage that your opponent can't get back in the game. That's kind of the goal of this deck. You're going to draw a lot of cards, you're going to remove some opponent's threats, and you're just going to keep stunning them with hand traps and trap cards until your opponent gives up, has to end their turn, and then you want to push for game. You don't want to give them another turn. That's a flaw I see with this deck, is that people just tag in and out of Sunny, and then the turn 3, they don't try to kill their opponent. You've already given them too much time at that point. And it is very easy to watch you lose a game because you didn't just try to go for a game. You always need to try to go for game with this deck. That's just how any anti-meta deck works. The moment your opponent has given you an opening, just take it. Don't waste your time. Now, this is the flexibility I'm talking about, is how this deck, look at how many cards in here are actually Evil Twin cards. We got 3 Secret Password, and then 3 Sunny Snitch, and because this is the maxed out, I would consider this a maxed out engine, it's 3 Home. That's less than half a deck. That is legit. Oh, wait, and Challenge. So this is half a deck. And this is, like, I would consider a fully maxed out Live Twin engine, is half of a deck. Now, the crazy thing is, you don't even need that many starters if you want to splash something else in. Like, Home can go down to 1. You can cut down the normal summons a tiny bit. Like, you start by cutting Kisses down because it's better than normal summon Lilith since it directly gets you to Frost. So you'd, like, do 2, 3, like, however you want to, like, fixate the deck or what you want it to rotate around. But this is kind of what I'm talking about, where this is just so many flex spots, and a lot of people want to go pure, and that makes sense, because with pure, even if you make the wrong, like, meta call, you still have a bunch of just generic cards to hold you over. Whereas, let's say you go Eldritch, but everyone's playing a lot of heavy anti-back row, well, that kind of messes you up. Or the same with, like, Sky Striker, is the same thing. And then Dogmatica, if you're actually going against trap decks, is kind of underwhelming. So, where if you play pure, like, most of your hand traps are going to work in any matchup. But if you mix in a deck, it doesn't mean it's necessarily going to be effective against certain matchups. But that being said, this is still something you got to keep in mind. Hand traps are not a win condition. They are not a true win condition, and a lot of hand traps, in all actuality, just kind of suck. They're a -1 interaction, and even when you're interacting with a spell card, they're just incredibly, incredibly underwhelming. Because with the addition of Crossout, Talents, and Called By, we are now at 7 hand trap counters, 4 of which just directly negate the hand trap, and 3 of them are, I would argue, is worse than negating the hand trap, because then they could just draw 2 fresh cards, rip away whatever's left in your hand, or even, like, take your board and just go for game with it. Like, hand traps are getting countered more and more as set goes on, and then when we get the Brave token, I don't even know how you're going to play hand traps in the future. But this is something that you need to understand, is hand traps are not a real win condition. You can't just hand trap your opponent to sleep and think, oh yeah, that'll work. That hasn't been working this format or last format, and it didn't even work the format before that. We were just flooding in hand traps because we just had the room, and if you were playing against Drytron, well, luckily you had the hand traps to make that matchup not unwinnable. But against everything else, hand traps were, you need like 2 or 3 of them to actually have an impact on your opponent's turn. And at that point, hand traps are just kind of useless. It'd just be better off being a board breaker. But this is where it gets a little more terrifying, is now that we have Crossout and we have more talents in in the game because of reprints, and Called By still exists, they didn't ban it. Like, hand traps are going to struggle to resolve, and you already needed more than one of them a lot of the time. So this is just a rock and a hard place for hand traps, and that's why I'm almost convinced that this will not work. Like, this war crime theory is going to stop working, because even when it was working, it was just like delaying the inevitable. Because the decks doing it didn't have their own win condition a lot of the time. It was like Zoo, and the win condition was Zeus. But, like, the hand traps didn't achieve that much. And back in the day with, like, Trickstar, the reason hand traps achieved so much is because the combo decks were so unbelievably pivoted towards that combo. There was no mid-range alternative for it. So, if you got to hand trap a choke point, a lot of time that did matter. Whereas now, it really just doesn't matter. Even at choke points, they just don't care that much. Which is like a major difference. But this, even if you want to cut hand traps, this isn't a deck that you want to do that in. Even if you want to say, I'm going to replace almost all, if not all, my hand traps for board breakers and things like that. But the truth is, because this deck draws on the opponent's turn with both Kissy Link and Frost, you have to play hand traps at some capacity. Like, that's not really an option for this deck. You always have to play a certain amount of hand traps, but that certain amount doesn't have to be flood your deck with them. Now, I went on about hand traps more than enough. I think hand traps aren't really a full-on great win condition for the deck, especially going into the future where decks can kind of just ignore hand traps, and they can even kind of do it now, realistically. So that's kind of a problem. But mixing your deck will also have the issue of making a wrong meta call could mean the deck you mixed with was just the worst part of your deck, to the point where you'll struggle to perform. Now that we got the hand traps out of the way, and now we've talked about the combinations, let's talk about things that are not hand traps that this deck can play. And one of them is actually Forbidden Droplet. And I think this card, as much as people always want to find alternatives to expensive cards, this is one you actually cannot find an alternative to in this deck, and Dark Ruler No More doesn't even come close to cutting it. The fact that this can bait with a Lilla or Kissy. You normal summon Lilla or Kissy, and they chain a negation, and you droplet their whole board, and then you send one of them to summon the other, and the other triggers because there's no other monsters. That interaction is so leagues better than any, like, legitimately anything Dark Ruler No More can do, that this is a card I think you should just run, and, like, any alternative you can find for this would just be far worse. And that's the honest truth. Like, this is, anytime I try to build a Live Twin deck, this is in it. Because there's no way I could take it out and be like, yeah, this wasn't performing. No, it's literally just so important. It feels like if it's not in the deck list, you're not going to do well for very long. So that's something very unfortunate to keep in mind. You're probably just going to need this card. Now let's go to the hand trap counters. And there's like Talents. Talents I actually think is really good. Actually, let me pull it up. Talents. So Talents I used to not like at all. But as we keep pivoting towards a mid-rangey game, like, it's not even formatted at this point because we've had several formats of it. Like, all the decks in the game are mostly mid-range. And they'll, like, activate a very simple board of a monster effect on your opponent's turn. But because their board is very simple, and because there's, like, so many things going on both players' turn by both players, like, Talents is becoming a lot, like, I respect Talents a lot more as the game kind of pivots to a more mid-rangey game where we're trying to make fair boards, but very low investment fair boards. And Talents is a way to really punish mid-range decks, funny enough. And since this is a mid-range deck, and even though this deck can play through hand traps, you don't negate the activations of said hand traps. So after they hand trap you and realize, oh, this didn't matter, you can go ahead and go through your full loop and then just talent something out of their hand, or talent something out of their hand beforehand, or like draw 2 cards. Like, this card's very nice. Very, very nice. Now, the other 2 hand trap counters I want to talk about are kind of interesting. Crossout Designator and Eagle Booster. So I'll talk about Crossout more because what I've noticed with Crossout and how it's been going is this is a very powerful card. Don't get me wrong. This is a very powerful card because of the fact that while Crossout simply exists, you have to deck build as if Crossout existed, even if you're not playing Crossout Designator itself. Because now you have to consider hand traps that are the prime Crossout targets, while at the same time, like, trying not to get hit with a Crossout in general. So if you look at what all the Crossout targets are and just play hand traps that Crossout doesn't hit any of them, not only can your opponent now brick on their Crossout targets, but their Crossouts themselves are bricks because there's nothing they can banish for it. So, like, that's something to keep in mind with Crossout. But because that counterplay to Crossout exists, a lot of the time, Crossout can just not accomplish much of anything. And the bigger factor is Crossout Designator is redundancy outside of Nibiru. Because you don't care if they Ash Blossom a normal summon if you have an extender. Like, you legitimately don't care. If they hand trap you, and you just extender play through all of it, this Crossout is not a card. It is nothing. And that's what I said earlier with the extenders and how people are playing them in Twin right now, is they're not treating them as real cards. They're just treating them as hand trap counters, But if they had more of the counters than hand traps, or their opponent just didn't have hand traps, these cards aren't real. They don't do anything. And Crossout is the same kind of thing, because it only really counters hand traps, because you're not maining, like, back row removal for this nonsense. The only time it's, like, fine against things not like hand traps is, like, Droplet, because you're playing Droplet, and if they Droplet your Sunny, you can just cross out it, because if they discarded a monster, you can chain this to it, but if they discarded a spell to try to play around this, you could just chain Sunny itself. So it really doesn't accomplish much of anything. So that's, like, what's kind of nice with Crossout. But outside of that, it is a lot more specific, a lot more targeted than people originally presumed. That being said, it's still so good that this is something you should consider, but don't consider this card mandatory, but you will always have to deck build around the sheer existence of this card. This one, on the other hand, I think is very unique, because Crossout only hits a handful of cards in any given tournament, but Eagle Booster prevents literally everything. If they Droplet your Sunny, you can Eagle Booster it, they discarded a monster. If they Impermanent, you can Eagle Booster it. If they use a hand trap on one of your Link 2s, you can protect it with Eagle Booster. Like, Eagle Booster is kind of insane in this deck, because a lot of the time, if you're just going into the Link 4 loop, you're only going to have monsters in your main monster zone. Or extra monster zone, my bad. So, this is very easily activatable. This card's all around just kind of nice. Also, one of the combinations I was talking about, which was Sky Striker, obviously 3 Eagle Booster and then some other Sky Striker cards would give you a lot of synergy with it. But that's it for the main deck. I want to just go over a few things about the extra deck, and then I'll call it here, because I feel like I've given you enough information about this deck already. But for the extra deck, I already explained, like, the Disciple Devotee IP stuff. Like, it can do a lot of very nice tricks, and it gives the extenders actual function past negating one hand trap. So that's fine. Firewall's also a nice addition. One thing I will say, the Link 2 Nightmares are kind of redundant. Cerberus and Unicorn only act as, like, far weaker... Cerberus and Phoenix only act as far weaker unicorns. And they also don't give you an effect that the deck doesn't already have, with, like, the case of Lilla or Sunny. Like, they don't actually accomplish much of anything. And in addition to that, their arrows are far more specific than unicorns. So I don't think you need to play either of the Link 2 Nightmares, because they are both very, very redundant. They don't offer you an effect this deck doesn't already have. Firewall access code, there are lines with Cyvers. Like, if you play some Parallel Exceed stuff, you can do some cool stuff with access code talker. Griffin is nice because of the IP line, but also Griffin is a card itself that can invalidate boards, because if you just summon it and it's not pointing to any of your opponent's monsters, your opponent's entire board doesn't function. Like, they can't activate any of their effects. So it's almost like a pseudo Dark Ruler no more. So keep this card in mind if you're looking for that kind of effect. And one final thing I want to mention about extra deck options is a lot of people are looking for the Zeus package. Now, I want to point out that I consider this not necessary, but it's something you can run. Because a lot of people, they're like, oh, you have to play Zeus in this deck. You have to play Zeus. But let's actually think about how terrible this engine actually is for a moment. In order for you to Zeus, without activating a card effect, you have to have a normal summon, then have the corresponding extender to go with it. Then you have to go climb up into Zeus, and then use it, and that's fine. Then you're like, oh, you get to use Zeus. You haven't accomplished anything else. You haven't accomplished the fact that the win condition of this deck has not been achieved at all. As a matter of fact, the only thing you've done is summon a 3000 monster that clears twice. And there's a good chance you had to use both of those effects anyway. So, you've given up your normal summon, and you've given up your entire deck's win condition to summon Zeus to clear a board. So in order for Zeus to be actually insane, you have to normal summon one, have the right corresponding extender, and then have home so you can actually get to your deck. So that's also 3 extra deck slots to do this. So you're running 3 extra deck slots for a 3-card hand going second. And that's what I wanted to point out. This is not as mandatory as people make it seem. It's just like people are very tunnel vision to Zeus. Like, make sure you actually understand why you're summoning Zeus and not just like, oh, Zeus is on board, I win. Because a lot of times that's just really not the case. You also can't really throw this cards at your opponent and expect Zeus to be fine either. Because anyone who knows anything about this deck knows that if you're going to negate the links, you do it on the second link too. And then also, they could just save their negation for when the Centuria hits the board. They don't have to negate everything and then a Centuria hits the board. That's not how people will play unless you're on Edo Pro and they're just pressing buttons. That's not really the applications of these cards. They're far more limited than people would like to have you believe. And now finally, the extra deck cards I consider absolutely necessary, and that is 3 Trouble Sunny, more so than the other Link 2s. So 3 Trouble Sunny is necessary because you have to climb into multiples for the OTK, but it's also just something that always keeps the loop in circulation. And something else I want to mention is you do not have to play 3 of these each. As a matter of fact, I think playing a 3rd Lilla is so absolutely pointless that it should have just never been in your extra deck to begin with. At least in the case of 3 Kissy Kill, you're deck building for some pretty grindy game states, where you have to make a Kissy just to pull a Lilla Link out of the graveyard very late game. But Lilla is not one you want to summon in those scenarios, because if you're in those grindy game states, the pop is more important than the draw, because you're already at a point where you don't have very many options left, so the draw doesn't matter. The pop is what's going to matter. So you've never needed 3 Lilla ever, and then 3 Kissy is if you're expecting a lot of grindy decks to show up. So keep that in mind. And I said Unicorn is far better than the other Link 2s because its arrows always match up with what's going on, and it also isn't just a redundant Lilla pop. So keep that in mind. Abomination is also a really good OTK card. And then one final thing is, if you don't even want to play the Disciple Devotee nonsense, you should at least be playing Lingeribo as a true use of the extenders, because otherwise the extenders actually just have no function in the deck, and they're not actually extenders. They're just more hand trap counters in a format where we're going to start to see people move away from, like, flooding their deck with hand traps. Like, that's kind of the truth. So, hopefully I've given you a lot of information, and you don't have to agree with me on anything at all, but this is a lot of information I've got from testing, watching people play test, watching deck builds, and doing deck building myself for like over a month at this point, is that this deck isn't... I almost feel like the way people are building this deck is a year behind, or it's just behind what it should be. It's very much building this hand trap war crime nonsense, not realizing we have so many hand trap counters right now that hand traps are going to struggle to work. But also, you need to understand that if you're going to have a win condition on your deck, and you have extenders to that win condition, you should try to use the extenders, and you should understand that the combinations you can put in this deck need to be the right meta call, since this is always going to be an anti-meta deck. You always need to understand what to do for the current metagame. But yep, that's about it. Thank you all for watching this long-ass video. You don't have to agree with me on everything, but you should at least understand a lot of time went into this theory, and it is not just me speaking. It is a lot of playtesting, watching a lot of people playtest, yada yada yada. And this deck, you're going to have to understand, is not going to be one of the best decks. It's going to be one of the best counter decks to whatever the best decks are. And if you're not going to deck build for that, you're just not going to do well with this deck. But thank you all for watching, and remember, Master Dinnerflex will take your soul.